In this video, we learn about building controlled form components and their benefits. Let's begin. Almost every web application or mobile apps have form elements that let the user key in data or typically select from a range of given options. Form elements are thus critical components of any application that will accept user data. React offers interesting ways to incorporate form elements into components. In this video, we'll take a look at a feature known as controlled form components. Let's take the example of a humble input element. Input elements such as an input field, select dropdowns, and text area incorporate their own internal state. When used in an application, they may not always reflect the true condition of the state, which in the case of React is maintained by components. This means that there can be a disparity between what the input element displays versus what is stored in the state. We ideally want React's state properties to be the single source of truth, even for form fields. For instance, if we wanted to convert user input to uppercase, we can easily do so as shown here using an inline function. In this case, whatever the user types in is converted to uppercase before being stored in the state. But the input element itself displays the text just as the user entered it. Wouldn't it be great if the input element displays the exact condition of the state? This can be achieved using controlled components, where React controls form elements in addition to using them for reading data from the user. This way, React state becomes the single source of truth for what the form elements display. This actually results in two-way binding, where changes to the data model, that is state, drives changes to the view layer, and changes to the view layer results in changes to the state. Two-way binding is a common and popular technique in frameworks such as Angular and Vue, and as you'll see here, it is easy to implement it in React. React only makes it a bit more explicit because of its advocacy of one-way data flow. Let's look at an example. As always, download and set up the project and fire up the development server. Our React app here offers three input elements as you can see. The name field is an input field, the nature of the query is a select tag offering three choices, and the query is a text area element. The core objective of this exercise is to have the user key in data, which should get echoed out in the box down here. This entire functionality is encapsulated in a component named MessageBox, which is simply being rendered using our app component at the root. The MessageBox component is a simple function component with three state properties, namely name, nature, and query. Our goal is to have these state properties as the single source of truth for the form elements. This has several advantages as you're about to see in a moment. Here we have our input elements in the JSX layout for the component. Let's begin with the input tag here. To capture user input, we'll use an onChange event listener, which will simply invoke the setName function to update the name property, which we have initialized using the useStateHooks function. Consequently, if I now type something here, it gets updated in the state variable name, which is what is being displayed here. Now, this is where you might need to use validators or formatting functions to process user input as it is being captured. We have such a function here, for instance, that formats our text using sentence case, also known as title case. To use this function, we'll simply pass the value of the input tag through the sentence case function before it is set to the name variable. Now, if I type in a name, you can see it being formatted and displayed down here. But notice the disparity between the way it is displayed versus the contents of the input element itself. This is because the input tag maintains a state of its own. It would be great if the input tag displays exactly what the state property name ultimately stores. Fortunately, this can be done using controlled components. All we have to do is use the value prop on the input tag and bind it to the name state variable like so. Now, whenever the onChange event fires, it updates the state property name, which in turn updates the contents of the input tag itself. I'm going to type everything in lowercase. However, notice how the text automatically formats itself to title case both in the output as well as the input tag. Now, one of the advantages that React's synthetic event system offers is a normalized API for working with various kinds of form elements. For instance, for our select tag here, we can once again use the onChange event listener in exactly the same way as we did for the input element. And setting the value prop here will ensure synchronization with the state property nature. Now, here's something really interesting. Remember how we are setting initial values of our state properties using three props, namely nameVal, natureVal, and queryVal? I'm going to go back to the app component and set these props to string values. This would happen in a situation where the message box component is supposed to display an existing record from a database, allowing the user to edit and update contents. In that case, our three fields need to display an existing dataset and still allow the user to edit and update. Once we have our props, you'll notice our fields are now displaying data that is coming through the props. What is happening here is that our props set an initial value of our state variables, and since our controlled components are in sync with the state, they're displaying the incoming data correctly. I'll update the text area tag as well and turn it into a controlled component like so. And this too displays the data as expected. And I can always update this data and everything stays in sync with the state. While this example used a function component with the hooks API, if you're using a class component, you'll essentially use this.setState function to update the state properties. The important thing to keep in mind here is that setting the value prop basically renders the field uneditable. For instance, setting a static string as the value prop will render the field read only. Such a form element will not let you edit its contents. The only exception to this rule is if the value is set to null or undefined. This is why we use a combination of an event listener such as onChange with state that cycles back the value into the form element. Having said all this, it should be noted that certain form elements will not allow you to use the value prop for building controlled components. For instance, when working with a checkbox or a radio button, you'll need to bind the checked property. Controlled form components are extremely useful when you want your form elements to stay in sync with the value in the state so that an accurate representation is shown to the user without any overheads of manually synchronizing the fields with the state. Form elements push data into the state, which is then pushed back into the form element. In a nutshell, these form elements are controlled by React. In the next video, we'll take a look at uncontrolled form components.